So initially, the idea for this talk was to explicate Heidegger's notion of the being of the human being as Dasein, the being that, to put it simply or not so simply, can and must transcend over beings, free itself from its entanglement with the world, and by accepting its being towards death and its inevitable thrownness into its epoch, ecstatically again and again can push itself out of itself and thereby finding freedom in those instances of finite self-transcendence that the highest depict repetitions of the worthy heroic, according to Heidegger. Now, the word hyperbole or hyperbole comes from the prefix hyper, and the verb ballo can be translated thus to mean to throw over and beyond, as we also heard this morning to some degree. The idea was furthermore to connect this to the burgeoning epoch of the digital virtual, of which we are the early children, challenged forth to suffer its rise and master its formation, but also we have the occasion of its founding and grounding. Yet as I began to travel to Cambridge again, as I have done quite often in recent years, and I began traveling here for this in spirit weeks ago, and as the horizon for this occasion began to beckon and became one of the horizontal possibilities of my existence, I also began to reminisce on my peculiar relationship with some of the people here in Cambridge. For recent years, even though I left official academia more than 2 years ago to fund my own online digital-based philosophy academy, I have found myself several times either presenting at Cambridge or in private conversation with lecturers and recent graduates of Cambridge. For some reason, rarely or almost never the other place, though. Even though I'm certain what this epoch will bring is also there being vigorously investigated, diagnosed, and laid out. One of the notions one can often hear in conversation publicly in and around Cambridge is the notion of the metaversity, not to be conflated with the metaverse. The metaversity is currently arising online and has been for some time. James Orr talks about this, for example, as established universities and institutions of higher learning suffer from various modes of regulatory capture. And strikingly, the advent of the wide use of digital technologies paired with the groundless hyper-morality has turned the idea of the university into a place of technocratic administrative bureaucracy geared towards stifling thought as best as it can, while demanding research output that can immediately be made operational. Universities today are no longer even ashamed that they define themselves as hubs of bioscience or industrial parks. So I don't think anyone should be ashamed if they charge money for their courses also to be able to make a living. Thus, the conditions inside traditional academia have contributed to paving the way, or rather have contributed to creating the pressure that is now giving way through accepting, affirming our peculiar thrownness and transcending towards the new possibilities, to new avenues of higher learning and education actualized in the digital virtual project in which I've been engaged in for the past 5 years. Today, so rather than giving just a theoretical talk on the possibility of understanding Dasein anew for the digital age, I will speak on the development and establishment of a digital-based institution of higher education, or Bildung, as the German vernacular says. I'll come back to this later, of the word Bild, so images in there, of a metaversity that can potentially actualize the ideal of the university, the courtyard of the one and the many, its possibilities and dangers, free from the current constraints of established degree mills.
Johannes, before you begin, could you stand a bit further back? The camera can't see your face. It's only.
Where's the camera?
It's that owl device.
This,
that little.
This the owl.
That's right.
Oh,
So you
this
got
the
to stand a
owl.
bit further back, otherwise it's only going to capture your.
Maybe I just sit down.
Well, if you sit right here, actually, or nearby that owl, it'll track your voice and movement. That's perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Is that better?
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, I didn't know. I thought it was this one here. Let's check. So Before I go into this further, maybe a word of warning. When the first mechanical watches were produced, which freed telling time from the sun, but which also led to the homogenization, hence the flattening of time into real time and the strange non-time, perhaps, of the seemingly ever-present internet called Unix, which allows to stamp every click, every copy, etc. with a definite second, some were quick to pronounce the god, the great machinist or watchmaker, who, as we know with Babbage, became the programmer. Yet, as the costs of the mechanical industrial revolution began to show and ravage the lands, the initial enthusiasm disappeared. Something similar, I think, will likely happen or is already happening with the digital world and AI. With the advent of the mechanical clock, humans were demanded to be on time, punctual as the clockwork. With the internet, we are challenged to be flexible, always available in a ghost-like presence. The simultaneous presence and availability of all creation is traditionally understood as hell. The schizophrenic excesses of the late Middle Ages, for example, the indulgence trade, which sought to harmonize the new world with Christian dogma, are repeated again today in some way. This should give us a hint, presumably Christian doctrine, forgive me, Ryan, will either bring forth schizophrenic ideas or demonize new technologies. We should understand much, if not all, of the demonization of technology. For example, the comparison of AI with the beast or the fear of Moloch, which is explicitly being aired by some as sometimes more, sometimes less crypto-Christian. Compared to the initial industrial revolution, digital technologies are spreading farther and wider and more quickly so, even to the so-called underdeveloped or third world. Connecting, but not necessarily bringing together the so-called world, or rather billions upon billions of images that an endless reflection within itself tend not to bring about a whole or totality. The internet at its worst is what Hegel calls the bad infinite, that is to say the finite instances that are made to be infinite in endless repetition. So the dangers of the digital are endless identity swapping through copy pasting, sheer endless differentiation, disintegration of order, LARPing perhaps, simulacra of meaning, disappearance of any resistance and limitation. The promises of the digital revolution are, in terms of the speed of the internet, already ancient, going back to at least the 1990s, strikingly coming out of the Thatcher-Reagan era, but realized, of course, by a left-wing avant-garde. At least the promise of unbound human emancipation and unstifled human creativity has given way more or less often to apocalyptic imagery of the post-digital. Inside establishment institutions, digital in combination with AI may lead to a surveillance, even if ultimately incompletable, on a scale hitherto unthinkable. Outside established institutions, that's my issue, the liquidity of the internet and the disembodiment that comes with it opens the possibility for rapid grouping and regrouping around causes or issues, meeting and finding the others we would never have met without the internet. Yet, to state the obvious, this very liquidity and openness also frees from the necessary obligations we usually have towards institutions and others in those institutions. A boundedness required, however, if there is to be human flourishing and newly emerging digital-based institutions. Thus, the question becomes how we can not only meet, but also encounter each other. The digital virtual, furthermore, lends itself to metaphysical speculation, perhaps to a mysticism of the hinterworld, as Nietzsche called metaphysics, the Hinterwelt, precisely because of the sheer endless possibilities of manipulation of the copies of the analog over which it commands. The attraction of irrationality to the hyper-rational Boolean formula, which is at the heart of digital, should give us pause. The question is, at least to me, whether or not the advent, and I think this was addressed also by Alec before, maybe also by Jackson, whether or not the advent of digital paired with the internet is not indeed a rift or rupture. The danger, hence, is precisely to assume that ways of old still carry any weight into the new paradigm. The looming threat of a copy-paste mentality always looms and looms large. The distinct Christian terminology and promises of either salvation or doom both always come hand in hand, strikingly, and notions such as the singularity or the warnings of the so-called supposed soullessness of the digital pandemonium at least in my view, falls short of what is at stake. Even and especially Nick Land's claim that technology is an extraterrestrial force from the future is still deeply religious and mystical, a promise of certain doom that only the initiated few have insight into. As are the attempts to attribute feeling, language, and thinking to computers. Another trajectory in this regard comes out of the Enlightenment and promises a sovereignty to the individual, hitherto unseen thanks to the internet. But at the core of the digital, there's still Boole's formula, which does not seem to allow for identity. In general, I would venture that attempts at integrating the digital into creation, and Leibniz basically tried that, forfeits the occasion to consider the new epoch of the techno-logos that the digital and by extension the imaginative notion of the hyper-digital brings with it. I think Ryan in this regard also speaks of ontological violence, if I understood him correctly. The rule of quantity and massification, which is the end game of modernity, is, however, exacerbated by the digital. But this at once also opens new spaces of exclusivity and indeed of a new aristocracy of spirit. The disintegration, disorder, fragmentation, the atomization, and congruent momentary tribalization that come with the liquidity and fluidity, not to mention the access to memory banks of thoughts that we no longer need to think through, of the digital virtual, poses a sincere challenge to thinkers. The further dissolution of science into digits removes the resistance of the body even further. The so-called post-digital posits but postpones the end, posits but also postpones the end of the digital. At the same time, one must also not forget the minima ratio of digital is and remains Boole's formula. Thus, the digital is neither a mere extension of the analog, nor does it necessarily mean its total destruction. Still, the digital requires of us a thinking and especially ways of educating that are not mere replications of the current university system. The apparent liquidity of the internet, the constant rebalancing of all and nothing, one and zero, the hybrid world that is emerging already between the digital that incorporates everything that can be digitized and that in turn directs us through the world that itself has become a constant source of data mining for satellites, drones, smartphones, etc. This now requires a renewed understanding, now we're going a bit down the limb here, of Heraclitean harmony, the balancing of what is at odds, as fragment 8 in Heraclitus, what is bursting apart. So Heraclitus has a very distinct understanding of harmony. For him, the most beautiful harmony comes about only in strife and is ever only momentarily in balance. And this to him is the most beautiful harmony. So that which is bursting apart, coming together, that which is dissonant, becoming consonant. Digital cannot copy the world perfectly, as we've heard many times today. Yet this means at worst that it remains parasitical on the world, where the world proper is to be understood as finite, limited, horizontal, and a place to encounter resistance. So I think in the digital, we also need some sort of resistance. My proposal thus is a strange one in strange times, but one that I live and work towards every day. The emergence of a cosmopolis through original Bildung online, or education, let's say. In our uprooted digital age, the polis, of course, is now an admixture of geographies and not based in a single location. But it's an ethereal cosmopolis, if you like. Yet the inevitable baseness and locality of the people who inhabit this polis remains. Their geology, now understood as the coming together of the inevitable locality and vernacular of participants with a new logos, which gives form, is being formed and gathers through ethereal parent relationships that require more intense face-to-face dialogue to be maintained than perhaps relationships require formed within and upheld within analog institutions and their various incentive structures. A logos which impacts participants in their respective geo-region. Geo, as you will know, comes from Greek, the earth and land in which they dwell and through which they also live. I leave the hyphen here and right after geo, so geology, so as to indicate how earth boundedness necessarily now is open to the ether of the digital virtual, but that this openness to this ether is also always and must remain of necessity earthbound. The hyphen between geo and logos in geology is now the human being who communicates at the speed of light through the digital virtual ether. After all, also silicon, lest we forget, is earth sourced and hence earthbound. The word cosmos here is to be understood as good order and beauty, which both come about in the peculiar way of Heraclitean harmony in the strife between analog and digital. And perhaps another word then for hybrid could be concrete, where concrete means to have grown together. In this way, I also understand the word university as all in one, all turning to come together in one. The university as it stands and operates today, of course, is planetary, wherever its physical location may be. The cosmopolitanism in question, which requires as a condition local belonging to a specific time and place, on the other hand, will serve us as a gateway towards projecting, I think, a genuinely cosmopolitan university free from such planetary constraints, twisting them in such a way that they give way to the cosmopolis. Cosmopolitanism of the internet could, of course, be also reduced to the uprootedness of Cartesianism. Yet there is another possibility for it along the lines of a locally bound, outward striving cosmopolitanism, not as a citizen of the entire world, but as a member of an order that brings order. The cosmopolite is bound and belongs to a locality. He or she is also bound to the cosmos. Now very briefly on Paideia, and I cannot do it justice here. Of course, as we also have before, we cannot relive the past fully, and Paideia is not revivable for us in a perfect sense. And but it's relevant in the sense that it provides us with a deep memory of who we are, of our humanitas. Considering Paideia again casts us into this memory of ourselves, into the anamnesis of what it means to be human. Remembering Paideia, which is the task to be completed again and again, is akin to remembering our humanity. Paideia connects us in a loving and appreciative manner with our heritage and ancestors, while Philanthropia connects us to humans present and future. Paideia is, of course, usually translated as education. And we find one predominant example of Paideia and apaideia, its opposite, in Book 7 of Plato's Republic. Right at the beginning of Plato's myth of the cave, Paideia and its opposite, apaideia, are introduced. They are conjoined, we can say. They always come together. The cave is a primal image of the European mind, and is the trajectory that coins the longing for the light of the sun and the good, longing for an escape, longing for enlightenment. Of course, also the light of the sun can become seductive and misleading in its own right. Sheer sunlight without shade will burn the earth. The path of Paideia presents the possibility of knowing and even seeing the forms in the idea of the good, seeing what is actual through thinking, rather. In some sense, the cave also already foretells simulacra and the simulation. How can that be before any sort of mass media? To keep it simple, this is beyond the scope of anything I can say here, the real or the actual are never simply given. They always arise out of the tension between that which appears and how we respond to it in thinking, for example, or poetry. In Plato, again, to come back to this, Paideia and apaideia go together, so education or non-education. The human being is born with the endowment of Paideia, but is constantly under threat of falling into its opposite. Paideia is an endowment of the human being, and so is apaideia. It can never be entirely overcome, as maybe Enlightenment reformers may have believed. there will always be apaideia, or as Plato says at the end of book 7, there will always be those, and necessarily so, those who remain stuck in apaideia and who are deaf to truth. As you know, the cave myth does not end outside the cave, but inside the cave. There's a need to return out of pity or compassion for the others, but there's also a threat of death to the one who actually returns. The philosopher, as Plato relates, is the one who returns into the cave and rules by means of insight into the forms, but also a superior understanding of the workings of the shadows. Shadows can also not be gotten rid of. There is no escaping the shadows. The philosopher carries the light of the good with him, which lets him or her see the shadows for what they are. Now, we live in times that are Protean. Yet even Proteus, dwelling in the sea, the place of memory, subjected to Poseidon, and Proteus was the one who knew all things present, past, and future. He had to show his true form from time to time. Building a digital-based institution of higher learning thus requires the continuous lived cultivation of dialogue between its members and also radical self-critique. Such dialogue cannot be automated or mechanized. Virtues such as loyalty and honesty are indispensable, as well as the 4 classical virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, courage, which I think all await a re-articulation for our time. The notion of Bildung I mentioned before briefly. The word Bildung hangs together with Bild, image, which is not to be understood here in the sense of imitating an image, or to become a representation of something that is already given, but in the sense of retreating oneself so that something or someone can come to the fore with guidance and direction by their own accord. Neither human emancipation nor creativity are ends in themselves. They must be directed. This is what the digital classroom, as long as it remains free from constraints such as providing certification and accreditation, can provide. And now, coming to the end, in fact, accreditation is one of the fundamental ills of the contemporary university. In organizational terms, running a digital, virtual, in fact, cybernetic institution is akin to steering a ship. Kybernetes, after all, means steersman, and the verb kybernan means to guide and to govern. And Plato likens those who steer the polis to navigators of a ship. The current rulers, he says, of course, are not true Kybernetes, because the true navigators must be, as Plato says, cosmos bound. They must be able to see the whole. So I'll leave it at that for now. I don't want to take up too much time to defend it.
Thank you, Hannah. That was
Yeah,
really
thanks.
so exciting. There's so much to discuss, and I fear that we won't have nearly enough time to really delve
Okay,
into all the
dinner.
details.
So
Yes, undoubtedly. So I suppose I have 2 questions. On the one hand, I take it that you're critiquing the post-digital as having a kind of apocalyptic rhetoric, in as far as it makes a kind of sheer break from the digital hegemony of our modern world, and points you a way of you might say celebrating the sort of entangled relations of the world, but without genuinely escaping from that binary logic.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it sounds like much of your talk I took today was a kind of resounding social critique of our digital culture and the way that it sort of affects not just the way we use technologies, but even our experience, our existence itself, our fundamental experience in the world. And then education has been providing the avenue of escape from that, the sort of elevation of the philosopher out of the cave, but nonetheless sort of governing the cave. And then the university classroom is going to be the sort of the crucible in which this education can occur and in which we can all escape afterwards. So I guess my question is this: how can the digital classroom remain incubated from these currents of modernity that you recognize as being so corrosive, and that the post-digital has sought to escape in vain, but for which you are hoping to find an education route that will be more fruitful?
Yeah, I'm glad we have a recording of this, because I basically copy paste everything you just said and put it in my essay in the final version. Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, you said it better than I did what I was trying to say. to keep it brief, and perhaps I hope that it's still on point. I think it begins with, and this is very early stages, I think, for everyone, because we're trying to make sense of what the digital really is. And I think that some of the early 20th century media theorists, Marshall McLuhan, Baudrillard, etc., maybe cannot even help us that much anymore. That's just an aside. The way in which, though, there's obviously no recipe, so I wouldn't want to give a blueprint that this ensures that we will never be. Instead, we will never be. Instead, I would say that it's open because it's still ultimately even more human-based, which is also what I tried to say than an analog traditional institution, because it's so small scale and it's a few people, that it's obviously prone to error and making those mistakes, and also being captured by that. But I think so the comportment or the inner stance one has to take is to be appreciative of these very issues that they could arise, and through, I don't know if that's good enough, but through a continuous dialogue, etc., and just radical self-critique, one does not become immune to this, but at least aware of it when it occurs. And then we're back with the rebalancing. If that makes sense.
So the Heraclean harmony is this what's meant to hold together the continuous strife of critique.
Yes, and also yes, and in the next step, I don't know if I went into this enough or made it explicit enough. So I think someone like Baudrillard, for example, they would think, as you know, Baudrillard would think that the world basically disappears, and what we would now call the digital or the simulation is all that remains, or in the end just the simulacrum. I think that if we take that notion of Heraclitean harmony, which is one of strife and the momentary coming together of what is at odds, and there could be here also a different approach to bridging the two quote unquote worlds, the digital and the analog. So.
Olivia has a question.
Yeah, this is really interesting. There's a lot of stuff that I found interesting in here. There's just one point that I was wondering if you could elaborate on a little bit. I thought it was really interesting how you said that the classical virtues await a rearticulation in our time. And I was curious, like, what do you think about those virtues is like no longer compatible, or our understanding of them is no longer compatible with the digital world, and how do they need to be rearticulated?
Well, we can. Yeah, that's a great question. So this obviously, as I haven't done this yet, and there may be someone else who's better equipped to do this. I think, though, even though we can say that they are, let's just in vernacular terms say that they're kind of timeless or eternal. They speak to us, and they speak even across civilizational boundaries, etc. They still, I think, in every re-articulation, they need to be articulated so that they are so that they speak to us in our context. So Aristotle did not have to deal with an iPhone in his pocket. I'm not aware that he did. There's actually someone, his name is Josh Hochschild, I hope I pronounce this correctly. I had a couple of conversations with him. He wrote a book, Mind at Peace, together with a colleague whose name now I don't remember, which is actually a rearticulation of, for example, temperance in our time. So the work is to a certain degree already being done. So I think even though, they are in some sense, let's say, eternal, timeless, hence they speak to us, they still always need to be situated in the context in which we are. And yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
thanks, Olivia.
Jackson Barrett has a question.
Yeah, thank you for that talk. That was fascinating. I practice mostly in like a Hindu lineage called Mudrashram, and in that lineage we understand reality and metaphysics as like a cartography of different levels of physicality, I guess. There's the physical and material realm, and then there's the psychic realm, and beyond that, there are like the super conscious and ultra conscious realms. I guess a question I've had for a while, and I'm curious your opinion on, is where do you see technology fitting, like within those realms and within understanding? Like, do you see it? You said because it's grounded in silicon, it's an earth-based thing, but do you see it as mixed with something beyond that, or do you see it purely as a physical form?
No, so yeah. Well, it's also ethereal, right? Because it opens us up to there's something strange about technology in the sense that the forms have been, someone mentioned before, I think it was Jesse, mentioned telepathy. Was it Jesse? Mentioned telepathy before. So there is something about that. And so it's not purely physical, but it is always, so to be earthbound means that there's always limitations that perhaps we sometimes then forget. So it's not just purely extraterrestrial or so, but it does connect to something else. But I think also maybe give a bit of a stranger response to your question. You mentioned that you're in Wyoming, but you practice Hinduism. Now, maybe 100 years ago, no one in Wyoming would have practiced Hinduism, or maybe even 30 years ago, who knows? So, if you want to be cynical, and we could say, well, it's all just a metaphysical supermarket. We walk in and we a bit of Buddhism, a bit of Christianity, but none of the stuff that really hurts. I like Christianity. I like loving your neighbor, but original sin, no.
Yeah.
So I think but now to the strange, actually, my actual response that is a bit weird perhaps, is that technology it opens us up to memories of others that shows that there must be something unifying at the core of the world. And do you see what I'm trying? I don't know if that getting any.
No, I understand.
But so there's a strange sense of a oneness that I don't want to substantialize or so, but this is so the non-cynical way of looking at this is why can we at all be open to something so strange to where we are, is because I think in technology really or in the digital or something is really coming through that lends itself to such new forms of spirituality that actually show that and there's another project I'm working on, it's endless, is that what is always lurking everywhere is deep memory.
Thank you. I don't know if you've ever been to Los Angeles, but I live primarily in Los Angeles, and I think it is a fascinating place. When you reference like the supermarket of spirituality, is a superficial way of understanding it, but that is what's going on in Los Angeles. Like there are all of these new forms of spirituality kind of constantly emerging and re-emerging from people picking and changing and trying to like understand their world in that way. And it is a fascinating thing that's happened because of technology.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jesse Parent, do you have a question?
I have a lot of things to say, but I'm just going to be really brief and say awesome discussion about this. I would really like to continue it. And I've been really thinking a lot lately about how kind of bridging from what Jackson and has been said, excuse me, is like how much technology has allowed us, like there's certain requisite amount of technology, internet and development that has kind of been required for us to get a certain kind of feedback about what it means to be human. Like oh, not now you have this more Hindu practitioners in Wyoming, or like there's a certain technological buildup that has allowed us to see things, but they've always been there. And I think
Yeah.
that's a really interesting dynamic of there's been a requisite development of this external tool, but it's also revealing this wide, like universal human experience too. And I feel like some of the cool stuff and what I kind of said in the comments is like across generations, like a couple generations ago, like only 3 channels on TV. So like there's all these different networks and experience methods that are available now. And I just think that's a really fascinating space. So much more conversation about that later future, hopefully. But thank you very much.
Thanks.